Find your focus. For the next few months, mine will be catching up with some old favorites like Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and all the other characters from the original Star Trek series. Let me know in the comments down below. Do you have a favorite? Original, Star Trek Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, the newer versions? For me, it's definitely the classic from the 1960s, which is when I made my appearance into this world. And so, of course, the original Star Trek is what I began with, and they continue to be my number one favorite. But I also enjoyed the Next Generation as well as the Voyager series. The book Trek tag was started by Vin at Revenant Reads. It runs through June, July, and August. For more information, be sure to go check out his channel. So in June, what did I read as part of my participation in the event? If you've watched some of my book haul videos in the last little bit, my journey began trying to find Star Trek books to read. I had sadly unhauled my books years ago. I checked my public library and all they pretty much have are graphic novels. I'll have to do another check. So off I went to my local thrift store, where I found Star Trek Probe. This is a novel by Margaret Bonanno. I very much enjoyed this read. I was happy to find this book because, as the clerks at both of the thrift stores that I go to mentioned, when Star Trek or Star Wars books come in, they disappear pretty quickly. So obviously, I'm not the only one interested in getting back to reading these stories. The story picks up where the fourth movie left off, The Voyage Home. So George and Gracie are now settled on Earth. The probe has become an issue again, and throughout the novel we learn more about the probe, the civilization that created it, and its purpose for being. It was a very enjoyable read. There were parts of the book that did remind me of Star Trek, the motion picture. So we have some parallels with V'ger. I enjoyed that as well because it's always nice to make different connections between stories. It was nice to learn more about the probe, and definitely a pleasure to revisit some old favorite characters and just get lost again in that time frame. So I highly recommend. Let me know if you've read Probe or any of the other works by Margaret Bonanno. I do know someone has left a comment in one of my previous videos, so I certainly plan to check her out and read more of her works. If you've seen my last book haul, and I'd been mentioning that I was so sad that I unhauled my Star Trek books, and thankfully I found all but one of the set during my last trip to my thrift store. So these are Star Trek log. They go from 1 to 10. The only one I'm now missing is number 9, so I'll be going in search of that one, and I will definitely not be unhauling these again. The series of books were all written by Alan Dean Foster. They're adapted from the animated series that was created by Gene Roddenberry. Each logbook has 3 different stories in it. As I say, it was lovely to revisit the characters. I enjoyed the banter again between McCoy and Spock, which was so much a part of the original show, and it comes through in the writing and in these episodes. So in log number 1, the first story is Beyond the Farthest Star. And if you've watched Star Trek The Next Generation, There are parts of this story that will remind you of Lieutenant Yar's last episode in that series and that particular creature. In this story, the Enterprise comes across a large mass. They find themselves getting pulled in and unable to pull back. They discover a massive alien ship. It doesn't appear to have any life on it. They're finding out that it has been there for a very long time, so they're not expecting to find anyone still alive. Crew goes over to check things out. Of course, there is a presence that they discover that has managed to survive. It comes aboard the starship with them. They, of course, have to find a way to not only get away from this thing that is pulling them in, but also get rid of the presence from the ship. I very much enjoyed the read. It was suspense. Like I say, the old familiar banter between Spock and McCoy was very well written. The second story is Yesteryear. In this case, there is a portal that they can travel through time. In the beginning of the story, they've done that. They figure everything's okay and they're on their way with the scientists. But then Kirk notices no one remembers who Spock is except for him. So they have to go back to the portal. Spock has to go through the portal to a very painful time in his life on Vulcan. He has to be very careful that he doesn't change anything in the timeline, but he also knows there's something that needs to be reset in order for him to get to the future and have people remember him again. The third story is One of Our Planets is Missing. In this case, again, we have a massive unknown entity that is coming. It's destroying planets. They need to find a way to communicate with this creature because it's coming closer and closer to an inhabited planet where there are millions of people. Thankfully, as always, the Enterprise finds a way to make things turn out. They find a way to communicate with this creature. It's very interesting, and we learn a bit about the creature as well. And in this case, it also has to do with Spock being able to connect with the mind of the entity. And that certainly came up in different episodes in the series. All three stories were a very enjoyable read. What I did find interesting is that Chekhov is not in any of the stories. So I'm curious to see if he comes up in any of the other stories. I also finished Star Trek II. This is the second book in the series. Both Star Trek Log 1 and Log 2 were published in 1974. That makes me giggle because I was all, woohoo, 10 years old. Makes me laugh even more because there are so many people who will be watching this who weren't even around yet. So, yes, for me, this brings back great memories of the show, of the reading, and for other people, it is definitely into the past that they don't remember. The first story in Log 2 is called The Survivor. So we meet a race of individuals who are able to shapeshift. There's also the Romulans, and it involves the neutral zone. It was an enjoyable read. This particular alien was able to take the form of a human that was well known to people on the Enterprise. That in turn created some problems because they had to try and find this alien. They were dealing with the Romulans because they were in the neutral zone. And of course, the situation between the Federation and Romulans is always just, it seems, on the cusp of war. So it's a very suspenseful and interesting chapter for sure. Number 2 was the Lorelei signal. Again, fascinating. Yes, I'm laughing because in high school my nickname was Spock, and of course one of the words that Spock always used was fascinating. In this chapter, the Enterprise is sent to go and discover why certain ships are disappearing in an area every 27 years. And it isn't just Federation ships, there's Klingons and Romulan ships. So they want to find out what is it about this particular area that pulls these ships in, and they're never seen or heard from again. The Enterprise goes in. What they discover are a group of women. There's a particular vibration and sound that has a very serious effect on the men and their thinking and the choices that they make. So thankfully in this chapter, it's Uhura and Nurse Chapel that come to the rescue and find a solution to what's going on. And they're also able to help the women with the situation. I enjoyed that particular read because I love that Uhura is presented as a very strong, competent woman. The third story, The Infinite Vulcan, had more than one surprise. The story is about a planet that the Enterprise goes to. They believe that the civilization there is gone. There's all these ancient buildings, but initially they don't find anyone. They do notice some plants, and one starts to follow Sulu, which they think is kind of cute. And as we go through the story, they discover that the civilization on this planet is actually plant-based. If you're a fan of Farscape, you'll remember they also had a character in that show. I wish I could remember her name right now, but I really liked the character, and I remember she was this beautiful blue, which I'm sure for the actress wasn't easy having all that makeup on all the time, but she did such an amazing job. So as I was reading this story, I was also thinking of her and how she moved through the world and all that she could do. We find out that a human had landed on this world a number of years prior. Sadly, as we know from our own history, when this human landed on this world, he brought diseases that these individuals would never have been exposed to, and a large part of their population was destroyed and devastated because of that. So there were some experiments and plans going on, and we find out as we go through the story what that actual plan was, and part of it was to leave the planet. So Kirk and, of course, the away team need to find a way to get back to the ship and avoid this plan from taking place. For me, the big surprise was that the original script for this animated episode was written by Walter Koenig. Yes, Chekhov. I also rewatched a few of the movies, and I have the box set of the original Star Trek movies. I also have the movies from The Next Generation. I'll be watching those in July. So I started with The Wrath of Khan. Yes, here we have Chekhov. I enjoyed that the movie included Ricardo Montalban, the actor who originally played Khan in the TV series. So I loved that it was the same individual. I enjoyed Ricardo Montalban as an actor, certainly in Fantasy Island. I remember seeing him, and he just has this amazing presence and voice that pulls you in. I can't remember now if Ricardo was in his 60s or 70s when they made the movie, but he was certainly in excellent shape because those muscles weren't CGI. That was a man in some pretty amazing shape. The story, of course, has to do with the Genesis Project. We find out that Kirk has a son, They need to deal with protecting this project, as well as finding themselves again having to deal with Khan, a character from long ago. It's also interesting that the ship that Khan and the others were found on was called the Botany Bay. And that, of course, ties in with human history as well. So it was interesting how we have these clues about where humanity was going, what happened, and how that ended up becoming a factor in the future. I very much enjoyed The Wrath of Khan. It's a story about where humanity was headed, even though the time period for when Khan and his group were supposedly created has gone by. It still, with all this playing with genetics and other things, makes you wonder, could there ever be someone like Khan and the others being developed somewhere in a lab? The movie also addresses the issue of how choices in the past have an impact on the future, not just in the short term, but in this case, many years into the future. It's a good reminder for people who are making choices about how best to resolve certain issues and considering the consequences, not just how is this going to improve things in the short term, but what could be the long-term impacts. The next movie that I watched, of course, is The Search for Spock, because if you've seen The Wrath of Khan, and I'm not going to give away what happened, but we do know that there has been a major change in our character of Spock. I remember watching that in the theater the first time, and it was just devastating. And of course, because unlike now, it was a while before the next movie came out with the Genesis planet, how that impacted Spock and his future. Of course, Khan is not in this movie. That storyline was wrapped up in the previous movie. But here now we end up having Klingons come in because you always have to have a villain in something to keep the story moving. So in this case, we have Christopher Lloyd, not the hair sticking out Back to the Future guy, but a very difficult Klingon to deal with. We also have Sarek, and again, I think it was wonderful that they were able to get Mark Lenard, who originally portrayed Sarek in the series, because to me, it's important to have that continuity, especially for this type of a movie and the series, because as fans, you got to know a certain character, not just the way they behaved, but they were that character in your mind. Maybe that's part of the reason why I haven't watched any of the newer Star Treks. And that's nothing against Chris Pine or any of the other actors who stepped into those roles. It's just, for me, Captain Kirk is William Shatner. Spock is Leonard Nimoy. McCoy is DeForest Kelley. No matter how good the actor is or how well they portray the role, for me, it is always those three individuals. It just has to be. The other fascinating thing with this movie is it was directed by Leonard Nimoy. So I really enjoyed that as well. The final movie that I watched in June was The Undiscovered Country. Here we have Scotty. This, of course, involves the Klingons again. And in this case, we have Gorgon, who is wanting to make peace with the Federation. The Enterprise is to transport him to talks. Of course, not all the Klingons are on board with trying to work things out with the Federation. We, of course, know that Kirk has an issue with the Klingons as they murdered his son. So we have a lot of tension. We have a lot of differing opinions. Kirk, of course, is on the ship that is escorting this Klingon. It was very interesting to watch because it features Christopher Lee, who is just a phenomenal actor. I mean, you've probably seen him in Lord of the Rings if you're a fan. You may remember him from vampire movies and so many other things. He does an excellent job going off into the world of science fiction. Whatever character he portrays, he is just amazing. And of course, we have our regular crew of Star Trek individuals, so it's again a nice revisit. We end up seeing Kirk and McCoy on the Klingon homeworld, and they're facing a trial. They end up in a prison. It was interesting to see E-Man as one of the characters there, David Bowie's widow. It was interesting to see her in that particular role. The nice thing about watching these movies isn't just the enjoyable stories that they had, being able to see the guest stars come back and recreate the roles that I remembered them in. It was also nice to just hang out for a little while again with some old favorites who were definitely important to me when I was in public school, and coming home and being able to watch them on TV. Let me know in the comments down below if you've seen any of the movies I've mentioned. Do you have a favorite? Also, let me know if you're participating in Book Trek 2024. As I said, be sure to go check out Revenant Reads for more information. This month I didn't get to any of the away mission readings, but I do plan to do that in July. Be sure to give that like button a little tickle. Leave me a thumbs up or smiley face in the comments. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you know when I upload content that may be of interest to you. Until next time, live long and prosper.